Thank you for staying back till 5 o'clock. It's past 5 o'clock. I shall try not to try your patience too much. I'd like to thank UNESCO and Stan Dehaan for this opportunity. So it looks like India is the flavor of the afternoon. Okay? There has already been one talk about India. And I will talk to you about some data from India, but also hopefully try and convince you that there are some things that do work in India. Okay? And maybe those are things that we can take away from. It also sets the stage very well to say why we need an assessment and why we need cross-cultural perspectives and why is it that we need research to back up what we say. So the first study that was talked about in the earlier discussion, the Asar study, okay, essentially relies on using a passage for assessment, okay? And probably needs to also think about the fact that Indian writing systems are actually quite complex, okay? So let me try and see if I can tell you a little bit about how writing systems might matter in the acquisition of reading and literacy skills, and where that might position us in looking at assessments and the development of reading. Oh, this is the other one. So I come from UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. It's the first and only Category 1 institute in the Asia-Pacific region, located in New Delhi. And the primary focus of the institute right now is to mainstream socio-emotional learning into education systems. And we're trying to adopt a cognitive science, neuroscience, evidence-based approach to develop curricula and implement them across different countries, especially for adolescent kids. So we've, I think, had enough evidence through the morning that the brain, which is the seat of learning, is no longer a black box. Okay? We've learned tremendously from cognitive neuroscience, and it's time to bring in some of this evidence, both to educators and to learners in the classroom. And I think that's what sort of binds everybody sitting in this room here today. Okay? What I'm going to try and do is to take two examples from this, things that we've been focusing on at the Institute, to try and see how we can use this evidence to inform policy. Okay? So the first comes from the area of reading, and we return to the country of India, okay, which presents one of the most challenging examples of learning to read. Okay? So there are big cultural differences in how people across the world learn to read. And one of the interesting things in India is as if it wasn't complex enough, we are not only bilingual or multilingual, we are biliterate and multiliterate populations. Okay? So not only are children in India required to learn to speak multiple languages, they're also required to learn to read multiple languages. And these are languages that belong to different writing systems. And hopefully the figure on the right will tell you the complexity of these writing systems. Okay? So they are visually quite complex, many of these writing systems, but they are transparent in the sense that the sound-to-letter mapping in most of these writing systems is quite simple. So you sort of read and speak and write in a very similar manner, as opposed to an alphabetic system like English, which can have a deep orthography. So there's a challenge between how you're mapping letter to sound. So India has 20 officially recognized spoken languages, 11 officially recognized scripts, and every child who goes to school in India has to learn to read at least 2 languages, okay? And English and Hindi are mandated. And in a number of cases, you also have to learn the state language. So it's not at all surprising to find people in India who can read 3 different writing systems, okay? And I can assure you there's a large number of them who can do that. And a typical signboard in India is what's up there on top, will essentially reflect the directions to anything on the street in at least 3 languages. Okay? So in order to try and study how is it that children might be learning to do this, and whenever I present this data at scientific meetings, people are amazed that we worry about 1 writing system, and here you're talking about 2. You must be mad as a country. Okay? But India has been known to do things unconventionally. So for the children who were going to a good school, getting good reading instruction, and were exposed to learning to read two writing systems at the same time. So these are kids who come to school at age 5 and are taught how to learn to read two writing systems at the same time. Okay, so this is English and Hindi. And they are also taught skills of phonological awareness, the right ways to try and learn to read. And you find that a number of these kids, and this is data from about 45 children going to the same school from classes 3 and 4, who do tasks in naming, in phonological awareness, fluency, and learning to read. And you pretty much see that the kids actually develop math skills in both languages. Okay? And you find very strong correlations between the native language and the second language. Okay? So that was a very interesting finding for us, that if these kids are getting simultaneous exposure to writing systems, they are actually able to learn to read both of them. Okay? Then we went on to do some structural imaging with them and found that both these languages, which actually have different phonological units, one of them uses the syllable and the other one uses a phoneme, actually has a structural representation for each of these in the brain. Okay? So these kids actually develop very good phonological skills and can differentiate between a syllable and a phoneme. Then we went on to do functional imaging with these children and found that the reading pathways for both these writing systems were actually very similar. They overlapped remarkably. Okay? Not only that, as these kids, even by class 4, which is about age 9 years, were able to distinguish between when they were reading English and when they were reading Hindi. So on the first two slides on the right, you can actually see that the child can differentiate when they're reading words or non-words in English. Okay? But on the other hand, in a language like Hindi, which is very transparent, but they are reading a word or a non-word, the pathways are actually very similar. And so you see that the circuits are overlapping. So there are no differences in the regions used for reading words as well as non-words in Hindi. So that essentially told us that these were kids who were learning to read two writing systems at the same time that other kids were learning to read one writing system and were learning to do it very well. Which essentially told us when we were assessing these kids for different language skills and literacy skills, we should be looking at not one, but both language assessments. And this is particularly true in the context of dyslexia. Okay? Till 2015, teachers in India, in fact, psychologists in India, did not use tests that were developed in Indian languages or native languages to test kids for dyslexia. They were just assessing kids based on English. So when we used both these writing systems and assessed these kids, what we found was, if this is a typical sample that you've looked at, where there's a class of kids from class 3 across different sections, this is data from about 230 kids. And the lines that you see in blue and red are the lines where the mean minus this 2 standard deviation, that's the line the line of intersection, which sort of breaks up this reading profile into 4 quadrants. So on the extreme right, you have the good readers, or the kids who have picked up all these skills well in the classroom. On the extreme right are the kids who have had poor exposure in English. They are not dyslexic. They have poor exposure in English. Similarly, you have kids who have poor exposure in Hindi. And it's only the left quadrant which are the kids who are actually at risk for dyslexia. So there were huge challenges with assessment, which are now getting addressed when the assessment of dyslexia begins to happen. And this led to the development of Dali, which is the dyslexia assessment for languages of India. And it's the first standardized and validated tool available in 4 languages, but which we've now extended to 5 languages. Okay? And we hope in the next 2 years we'll be able to take it to 8 languages more, at least, so that kids across schools in India can get diagnosed correctly for dyslexia. These are primarily meant for primary kids between the classes of 1 to 5, so about 5 years to 10 years of age. And it includes, very importantly, a screening questionnaire which can be used by teachers. And we've been able to train about 5,000 teachers in the last 2 years to be able to start using these tools into classrooms so that early intervention can begin to happen. But I think this is where we want to send across a message to policy. If you look across the world, up there on the map, one can see that there are a number of countries across the world where there are multiple official languages. In such countries, it is important that native and second language research be conducted in order to ensure how children are learning to read. And very importantly, to ensure that this is mandate in policy that when kids for dyslexia are assessed, they are assessed in both the languages or all the languages of instruction. Because reading is a biological process. And you cannot be dyslexic in one language and not be dyslexic in the other. That's something that's a very crucial message that needs to get across to teachers and across to psychologists who do assessments. Coming to the next idea, which we want to draw attention towards, is the challenge that we have right now, which is a mental health crisis in adolescence. Here are the numbers which were provided by a WHO report on the number of people who might have anxiety and depression. And these are the numbers that come from adolescence. Okay? And the numbers itself speak on how big they are. 264 million kids report depression and anxiety in the classroom. It could be because of bullying. It could be because of challenges at home, in the school, in the environment, because of migration. There are a host of issues. But this is an issue which is all over the classrooms, and which, as was discussed even in the morning, hampers all learning, not just some learning, but all learning in the classroom. If the kid is afraid of coming to school, even if he comes in, he's not going to be able to learn anything in the classroom. So we need to find a way to try and address this. And the most important, I think, development in terms of research that has happened in the last 15 years has been the fact that just like you can teach skills of literacy and numeracy, you can teach skills of prosocial learning or socio-emotional skills. Okay? So prosocial learning, which is essentially a basic need in human beings to want to help the other, is there in all of us as human beings. Okay? It's just something that we need to build and enhance further in the classroom. Okay? It was earlier probably thought this would happen in the family or whilst growing up. But now that that's not happening enough, and we know that it can be taught, maybe it can actually be brought into classrooms to be able to emphasize and taught very clearly. Research also shows that prosocial behavior negatively correlates with depression, improves student well-being. So if we know that these factors are available, why are we holding ourselves back from bringing socio-emotional learning into education systems? In order to try and see how we might assess socio-emotional learning and whether there might be innovative ways to try and teach that, we decided to do a small study where we used now the power of the internet and the fact that children in the ages of 12 to 14 as adolescents are really talking a lot to their peers. They learn from their peers, they listen to their peers, and they operate a lot on internet and digital platforms. So we decided to use the platform as a means to try and set up what we call intercultural dialogue. Okay? So I'll talk about that in a minute. But before that, we want to try and see how we might assess socio-emotional skills. Most socio-emotional skill learning is assessed through questionnaires that are conducted, and teachers have a lot of work to do in that. Students find them boring to do. But increasingly over the last 5 years, there has been an increase in the number of games that can assess socio-emotional learning skills. These become very fun and engaging ways, and they get kids to engage in behavior, which can be socio-emotional in nature. How do you work with somebody else to try and achieve a goal? Okay. So we used one such game to try and assess socio-emotional learning, and want to try and also begin to encourage some research on trying to evaluate more of these games, which can probably be used and scaled in much more extensive manners as tools to assess socio-emotional learning. Okay. So we used one such called the Hall of Heroes, which is played across children across a classroom. And it assesses things like social initiation, empathy, emotional regulation, impulse control. And there are very innovative ways in the way the school gets them to, the game gets children to participate and perform activities as they go across the game. Okay. So taking this further, we conducted this across 5 countries. Okay. The countries were Malaysia, United States, Norway, South Africa, and India. And this is a program on intercultural dialogue. So students talk to each other on the digital platform where a question is posed, and they respond to it at their time of the day. It's a blended learning thing that happens in the classroom, where the teacher will discuss the idea in the classroom, and then the kids go back and engage on discussions about it. Each of these is happening in their respective countries. Okay? So the discussions are, however, not specifically on curricula, but on migration, climate change, citizenship, and identity. Okay? And we got about 200 to 240 kids to be part of this whole cultural exchange and used this game to try and assess socio-emotional learning skills. So I just want to quickly show you the differences that we found across cultures. Okay? So we find there are significant differences in how these skills manifest across different cultures. Okay? And there are interesting differences that emerge in collectivistic versus individualistic societies, where the focus on the upbringing and the community is quite different. Okay? So we found that kids in the United States and Malaysia were better than the kids in South Africa in communication. In cooperation, the kids in Malaysia were better. In social initiation, the kids in Malaysia and the United States were better than South Africa. And essentially telling us that in the processes of migration that are now happening across the world, many of these cultures are now coming together. And classrooms no longer consist purely of homogeneous sets of kids. They have all these kids sitting into classrooms. So somewhere our assessments also have to become valid for multicultural situations. And if they're performance-based and probably game-based, they are less language and curriculum-based. And they can really be used to look at skills that children might be developing. Similar results have also been shown across... You have to conclude, please. One more slide. Across Japan and the United States. And a pre and post study actually showed, on the Malaysian kids, showed that they actually improved in socio-emotional skills as they went through the program. So to wind up, we do think socio-emotional skills should be mandated into policy as soon as possible. And much more research is required across cultures to be able to evaluate this. But I think a question that is now sort of begging to be addressed is, across the morning, are we just talking about specific skills, or is it time that education itself get an assessment? Maybe it's time to do something at that level. Thank you.